Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the ARC of Massachusetts webinar series. Today's presentation will be on what the Autism Omnibus legislation means for individual, families, and DDS, from eligibility to service delivery. My name is Carrie Mahoney, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we start, let's just take a moment to ensure that everyone's ready. To minimize noise, you were muted upon registration. And if you're having any problems connecting, it's best to log off and reconnect. So you could just chat into me right now to let me know that we're connected. That would be terrific, and that you can hear me okay. Looks like you're okay. And you do have the ability to submit questions using the chat pane located on the bottom of the control panel. We'll be visiting these questions the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Janet George. Dr. George has been working at the Department of Developmental Services as the Assistant Commissioner for Policy, Planning, and Children's Services. In this position, she has been responsible for overseeing the department's efforts in designing new eligibility processes and service design for individuals with Autism Spectrum Disorders. Dr. George is responsible for the implementation of the system-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports within the DDS community. Her work also involves from supports to children and their families, strategic planning and policy development, statewide learning and development activities. Dr. George has more than 35 years of experience in the field of human services. She's a licensed psychologist and a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Massachusetts. So thank you, Dr. George, for joining us today and sharing your time and expertise.
Good afternoon. I'm going to spend some time describing the impact of the Act of 2014, which is known as the Autism Omnibus Law. These are the goals for this afternoon. I'm going to briefly describe the Omnibus Law, direct implications for DDS eligibility, some brief description about who these new individuals are that are entering the department, a description about the services and service coordination that we're going to be making available, and really our future hope for the growth and development of this activity. And then, as Carrie mentioned at the end, we'll spend some time fielding and answering questions that you may have. So let's start with why do we have a new law? So historically, the Department of Developmental Services served adults who had an intellectual disability. That there was a gap between our eligibility for children, which was based on the federal definition of a developmental disability, and that is broader than our ID definition for adults. And historically, many of you may know that we were one of the few remaining states that was an ID state only for adults, and they were not a DD state. So there was a lot of interest and concern from stakeholders that could readily see, as did the department, that we had individuals with autism spectrum disorder who fell through the cracks. They might be eligible as children and then not eligible as adults because they did not have an intellectual disability. That was the basis for the new law. Many highlights from this Autism Omnibus bill, many of them that impact the department and its plan to provide services for individuals with autism spectrum disorders. So I'll just briefly highlight some of the elements of the bill for you. Some of them should be quite familiar at this point. The bill establishes a permanent autism commission, and its purpose is really to oversee the implementation of the various components of this omnibus bill, which is quite detailed and complex. It establishes ABLE accounts, which really are in essence similar to 529 accounts for individuals with disabilities. This next one is a very important activity, it requires the DDS and DMH collaborate and figure out how to serve individuals that are newly diagnosed. Historically, this has been an enormous challenge for both departments. For those of you who are familiar with DMH's eligibility, if a person has a developmental disability, they are by definition excluded from service from DMH. So this section of the bill really addresses the need for the two departments to work, and more importantly, it puts DDS in the lead position to really work with DMH to effectuate some positive changes for individuals. It also requires that Mass Health cover apply behavioral analysis for children under 21, which is a component of the EPSDT program, which Mass Health is currently working on. Evidently, this service is currently available, even though the state plan amendment has not yet been approved by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. And then finally, which is the eligibility piece, it adds the definition of a person with a developmental disability, and it includes a person with an autism spectrum disorder without an intellectual disability, a person with Prader-Willi syndrome, again, without an intellectual disability, and Smith-Magenis syndrome. Those are the types of the bill. So briefly, just to refresh everyone, the department's eligibility for adults with an intellectual disability with an IQ of approximately 70. The verbs here matter, and I'm going to compare and contrast them with the definition for autism spectrum disorders. So the verb for people with intellectual disability is originates. And age, again, is different, which is prior to the age of 18, which means that the disability must begin prior to age 18. And then an individual must have significant limitations in adaptive functioning. So this definition has not changed. It has been in place since 2011, and nothing about the department's mission to provide services and supports to individuals with intellectual disability has changed. So that's one of the groups of people we're going to continue to serve. The bill established the definition of an adult with a developmental disability. So I want to go over the steps of what constitutes a developmental disability. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is this is not a clinical definition. This is an administrative definition that emanates from Congress, the U.S. Congress. Developmental disability is a chronic disability, and for the purposes of DDS, it covers 4. There are many developmental disabilities, but statute requires that we address and consider the following groups: individuals with intellectual disability, individuals with autism spectrum disorder, individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome, and individuals with Smith-Magenis. In contrast to individuals with intellectual disability, the verb here is manifest, which means observable and seen, and here again the age is different. So this is prior to the age of 22, which means that there are individuals who may be eligible for the department post 18 years of age if they are a person with one of those 3 developmental disabilities. The component is it means that the disability is likely to continue. Fourth is that the person will have substantial functional limitations in 3 or more of the major life activities that are covered by the DD definition. I'm going to go over what that actually means. But short of this means that there are individuals with autism spectrum disorder or Prader-Willi that, in fact, will have the disability manifested before age 22, but may, in fact, not have 3 functional areas of limitation. It's important to keep that in mind. So there are multiple doorways now into the Department of Developmental Services, and in this slide you can see the 4 doors, and these are the doors for adults. The door for children is a much broader, and I would describe it, if I had a graphic, as an archway. But the door for adult are these 4: intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder, Prader-Willi syndrome, and Smith-Magenis syndrome. So it's a good metaphor if you're attempting to explain this to families, that these are the 4 doors that currently exist for adults. You can see this is what they look like as you open them. What changed about the department's eligibility criteria? So how does this actually go? No, I think it's go this way. It used to be a person who have an autism spectrum disorder, Prader syndrome, but to be eligible as a person with an intellectual disability, which meant that a person could have more than one disability, but what was considered was the ID piece. So we currently clearly serve adults who have intellectual disability and an autism spectrum disorder, but they're eligible on the basis of ID. Next, a person can have an autism spectrum disorder, Prader-Willi, without having an intellectual disability. So this means that we will have two different groups of individuals with autism spectrum disorder, those with and without an intellectual disability. Same is true for Prader-Willi syndrome. We will have individuals, as we currently do, with intellectual disability, and now we will have individuals who do not have an intellectual disability who also have Prader-Willi syndrome. And lastly, we will have groups of individuals with Smith-Magenis syndrome. And those individuals, in my experience, always have an intellectual disability. Who are these new groups? And I think the statistics here are quite compelling. According to the CDC, there are 1 in 68 children with autism spectrum disorder. Now, this will show my age to a certain extent, but when I was trained early on, the ratio of people who were considered to have both an autism spectrum disorder and an intellectual disability was 70%. Over time, the professional community has come to understand that many adults do not have an intellectual disability who also have autism spectrum disorder. Those ratios are completely different, which is one of the most compelling reasons that the Autism Commission really wanted the department's eligibility to change. The numbers of individuals with Prader-Willi is clearly quite small, and in contrast to the ASD population, only 30% of them do not have ID. So these ratios are different than what individuals in my age bracket were actually trained to consider. And individuals with Smith-Magenis, which is another rare developmental disability, for the most part, all of them have ID. So you can see the impact of the law when a person does not need to have an intellectual disability for autism spectrum disorders or Prader-Willi syndrome. I'm going to go over to a certain extent what are the requirements for eligibility for ASD. First one is that a person must be domiciled in Massachusetts. And without boring you, there is a clear difference between being domiciled in the state and being a resident of the state. So these are legal terms. They mean very different things. It is much easier to establish residency, which is the standard for Mass Health, but the state at the Department of Developmental Services is domicile. The second requirement is that the individual must have a diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder based on the most recent version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, I want to stop here and clarify a question that I've received many, many times. So if an individual has a previous DSM-4 diagnosis and they met those criteria, then that's an acceptable diagnosis to the Department of Developmental Services. Because for those of you who are clinicians or who read the DSM-5 version, it clearly states if there was a verified diagnosis based on the DSM-4 criteria, that's in fact a valid diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder. The component is that needs to be an evaluation by a qualified physician or psychologist that establishes that the individual has an autism spectrum disorder, meaning that evaluation details and delineates how that individual individual meets those criteria from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And for younger individuals, we expect to see standardized instruments measure autism spectrum disorders. And I think this has been a source of confusion for individuals. You have a person who is older, that is prior to the usage of the standardized instruments, there in fact will not be any, and we do not expect that people will go and get those assessments completed. So in the absence of those standardized instruments, we want a qualified practitioner to write a competent evaluation. The person has to have substantial functional impairments in 3 of the 7 major life areas, and these are the areas that are embedded in the developmental disability definition. Self-care, which are basically activities of daily living. There are 2 different communication domains. One is expressive, which means can the person really communicate? The other is receptive. Can the person understand what is actually being communicated? Learning, mobility, the capacity for self-direction, which means can the person be an actor in their own lives? Economic self-sufficiency. Are they able over time to be able to really support themselves? In order to establish the functional domains, the department needs to use assessments. So we require adaptive measures. These are measures that the department itself will administer. We will look at additional information that is provided. We need to know that the information demonstrates, and again, here the verbs matter, which is why they're outlined and highlighted, that a person with an autism spectrum disorder, those adaptive limitations were manifested, existed prior to the age of 22. We're looking for documentation that the developmental disability is likely to continue indefinitely because definition requires that the disability be chronic in nature. We will look for personal information, clinical, psychosocial information, IEPs, psychiatric assessments, psychological assessments, because they all buttress the qualified evaluation that we assume we're going to receive. We're going to want all the previous adaptive measures that exist. If they don't exist, then don't go and get them. And although IQ is not a determinative factor, it helps us really figure out the person's strengths and weaknesses. So for many younger people, we know that they have IEPs, we know that they're 3-year assessments, and often there are IQ information, and we'd like to be able to see it. So Warren has a long history working with individuals who have both intellectual disability and an autism spectrum disorder. So I believe that we have a foundation for understanding people. However, the new group of individuals that are now coming into the department are individuals with normal intellectual development. So we're aware that we have a great deal to learn. We know that many of these individuals are going to graduate from high school, may not continue through age 22. So we're in the process of figuring out what kind of services we would provide to individuals who are between ages of 18 and 22. We also know that individuals have what are called splinter skills, which means they have areas of skill that are quite well developed and areas of skill that are not, and that we need to really think about how we can help individuals who have specialized interests to really gain meaningful employment. We know that individuals may have social deficits or executive functioning deficits, and that we need to assist people to really get and work towards meaningful employment. We also know, and this is really the link to the Department of Mental Health, that probably approximately 75% of the individuals that we are seeing now will have a co-occurring mental health disorder, typically depression and anxiety, and that those 2 issues may be more compelling than the fact that the individual has an Autism Spectrum Disorder. We're also concerned about substance use and abuse among this population. So this makes this quite a bit different for us from our ID population. So here's a summary for individuals with criteria without ID. So we need to have a diagnosis of an autism spectrum disorder, which means from a qualified practitioner. So in the past, when there was less diagnostic acumen or precision, we would get notes from pediatricians that would say something like autism light, which is not a diagnosis, either LIGHT or LITE. Neither one of those are diagnoses. So we actually need qualified practitioners to make that diagnosis, and it needs to be in a thorough diagnostic evaluation. The person must manifest those adaptive limitations before the age of 22, and they must have substantial functional limitations in at least 3 of those 7 major activities that I described earlier. It's not going. Okay. So, reliable diagnosis of ASD, because I know this is a concern to individuals in the community. So we want to see a full psychological evaluation as a child, particularly if it's a younger person. So if we're talking about someone who is applying for eligibility and they're less than 22 years of age, we expect that we will see a full psychological evaluation, that we will see differential diagnoses, meaning if the person also has a learning disability or depression or anxiety, but that we will stat it in the report, and that comes from a qualified practitioner. Now, a qualified practitioner is a licensed psychologist, a developmental pediatrician, a neuropsychologist. As individuals, that evaluation, more often than not, that we see comes from a handful of hospital-based developmental disability clinics. So those are all sources of and reliable evaluations. I want to see that there is a well-documented history of ASD, and we're going to look across multiple reliable sources. So we'll look at medical records, school records, records from therapists, a well-done psychosocial history. So it's really, that's what builds the picture for us. Sometimes the diagnosis is unclear or the standardized assessment is not present. So in those cases, this is what the department is actually going to do. It's going to obtain any records as possible from as many different sources as possible, which helps build that mosaic, that picture of the individual. We may very well have our licensed psychologist on our I&E team interview the individual, and we will simply look at the history of diagnoses because, again, in DSM-5, a lot of those diagnoses are now subsumed under autism spectrum disorder. So we expect to see in a newly diagnosed person PDD or Asperger's, but we know we will see it in a person whose diagnosis predates DSM-5, which is a couple of years ago. I want to spend a little time on the 7 major life activities because there are ways in which we get this information and there are ways in which we've had to create some new assessment tools. So these are 7 again: self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. So when the department began implementing the requirements of the bill, what we discovered is that the tools that we clearly use currently at Eligibility, the Vineland and the adaptive behavior assessment, were sufficient to map to the 7 major life activities. There is, in fact, only one instrument that does that, and it is labor-intensive and can only be administered by licensed psychologists. So what that meant was the department had to figure out how to create some kind of tool or questionnaire that would map to the major life activities that were not covered by those standardized instruments. So we set out to create, and some of you may have experienced this, it's called the Major Life Activity Questionnaire, and the acronym for that is MLAC. And 4 areas that it addresses are mobility, self-direction, economic self-sufficiency, and living, because those are, in fact, not covered by the Vineland or ABAS. We did a lot of research. We talked to other states that had implemented process to serve individuals with ASD without intellectual disabilities, and we spent some time piloting the instrument and came up with the MLAC tool. What happens at eligibility is the eligibility specialists administer either the ABAS or the Vineland, and if that individual is not sufficiently impaired in 3 of those 7 areas, the eligibility team administers MLAC. So we give everyone a chance to really demonstrate that they have 3 functional limitations. So that is completed. Now the person's eligible, and now there is a handoff, and this is how the handoff goes. So the individual receives an eligibility letter. A file is sent to the respective area office that covers the city or town where the individual lives. At the same time the person is noticed they are now eligible, they are contacted by one of the support intensity scale assessors, and the coordinator is connected and contacted. Over time, what happens is their services are explored and a plan is developed. So that's the order in which things occur once the person is eligible. If the person is not eligible for any of those 4, then the person will receive appeal rights. And one of the things that the department is doing is that people are not always clear why they are applying. So we consider all potential abilities among those 4, whether or not the individual has indicated that they're applying for one of the 4, because we don't have people come back multiple times and say, oh, I didn't understand, I thought I had an intellectual disability, or I thought I had autism, and I applied for autism, and in fact I have an intellectual disability. So the instruction of our eligibility team is to consider all of the 4. For those of you who are not familiar with the supports intensity scale, it's an assessment that is strength-based and focuses on what does the person need in the way of support to be successful. So we are currently assessing eligible individuals who have been found eligible under the new criteria, ASD or Prader-Willi syndrome, also conducting the SIS assessment on prospective turning 22 classes, i.e. the class that is prior to the department's having worked with individuals to establish what that service package might look like. The people who participate in the assessment are the individual, the family, key supporters in the person's life, but the critical requirement is that the respondents need to know the person for at least 3 months. And we encouraged our service coordinators, who for the most part do not know the new individuals, sit in on the assessment so they can begin to establish a working knowledge of the person's needs and aspirations. The support areas that are measured by the SIS include home life activities, which are basically activities of daily living, community, lifelong learning, employment, health and safety, and social. And the way SIS works is a combination of the type of support that someone needs, the frequency, which means how often the person needs support, how much time is required. Each item on the SIS is phrased, if the individual were to engage in this activity, what type of support would he or she need? So it really considers a person relative to other people without disabilities in terms of what support they would need to be successful. Then 2 or 3 other components of the SIS. One of them has to do with protection and the ability to advocate for oneself. And then the final one has to do with exceptional medical and behavioral needs. Each of the area offices has received or in the process of hiring a new dedicated autism support service coordinator. We spent the last 3 or 4 months focusing intensely on training these new service coordinators so that we can ensure that we are increasing knowledge and expertise about autism spectrum disorders, particularly for individuals who do not have an intellectual disability. The individuals on our caseload will be the primary responsibility of our new Autism Spectrum Disorder service coordinators. However, given that it takes time to build up these caseloads, these new ASD service coordinators are also helping with other caseloads in their offices, primarily transitioning individuals. Now, as a side, many of our normal transitioning students are individuals with both ASD and ID, so this is actually a good experience for our new service coordinators. These are types of services that are currently available for individuals with ASD. So, family supports, individual supports, employment supports, day programs, and respite. So if you think about these things, this is sort of a broad array of supports for people. They can be living in their family home, they can be living independently in support housing, they can be living in their own apartments, but those are the types of supports that we would be offering. Most of the individuals we have seen to date are very invested in gainful employment, so we need to think about how we're going to support people to get those jobs and, more importantly, to maintain those jobs. They all want something to do during the day, and for individuals who are residing at home, families have clearly said to us they would like respite. The department received a small amount of new funding, so the services are subject to availability, and our current planning involves budget of up to $20,000 to support these individuals. They can also receive, if they are on Mass Health, access to state plan services as well. We are offering the 3 different models of support to the new population as we have to our ID population. So we have traditional services provided by our nonprofit community. We're offering self-directed services through our fiscal intermediary, PPL, and we are offering the with choice model, which is the co-employment model, which is really between full self-direction and the traditional provider model. So we are encouraging people to consider self-direction. For many of these individuals, they want to be in charge of their own lives. Many of the individuals do not have guardians, and they have pretty clear idea of what would be helpful to them. We expect that over time we will have more demand than we have fiscal ability to meet people's needs, which means that at some point, if the legislature does not increase the allocation to the department, there'll be a waiting list for individuals. And these are services that are different than services for individuals with ID. Currently, we are not really providing residential options, and the services are capped at up to $25,000. And that's a direct response to the amount of funding that we currently have available. Our goal here is to make services available quickly. So we're trying to effectuate really meeting people's needs, hearing from them about what would be helpful. We do, however, need to use the models of support that we currently have available to us. So as a startup, we do not have the ability to offer services that are new. We need to hear from individuals and their families about what would be helpful so that in the future, if our current service package is not what is needed, we can develop those services. But since the goal here was to provide services as quickly as possible, we need to use our existing array of services. We're very clear that services may change from time to time, that they are subject to appropriation in the future, but the immediate goal is to plan and deliver for services now, and that's what we've really been about. As you know, have a set of proposed regulations. We have done public hearings on our new eligibility regulations. One day we picked for public hearing was the day of the Patriots celebration parade in downtown Boston, which heavily attended, although regulation hearing was not. We did receive public comments, and we're in the process of revising those regulations, but there is nothing that I've said that will impact our ability to move forward to continue to find individuals eligible under the statute or to continue to provide services. So likely changes in the regulations that we had drafted are as follows. We are likely to allow individuals to apply for adult eligibility at around 18, with adult services being effective at age 22. The reason that we're likely to change this from the draft is the concern among both individuals and the department staff that in some places they needed more lead time to do effective transition planning. We are clearly, as I mentioned earlier, paying attention to the needs of individuals who actually graduate from high school on time at age 18 and what those service needs are likely to be. Some know that when the administration changed and the Governor Baker took office, there has been what's called a regulatory pause. So that has some impact on our ability to move forward with these regulations. So relying on the statute that was signed into law by Governor Patrick in August, which became effective in November. Here are some of the future directions that we are currently engaged in. We are clearly engaged in working with DMH. We have done a joint eligibility training with DMH so that we begin to understand each other and why each of us said yay or nay to individuals. We are in the process of identifying service gaps between the two agencies so we can figure out how to best meet those needs. And we are working on a process to clarify who should be the lead for individuals with duly diagnosed individuals. So we are currently thinking that there are individuals whose primary issues are chronic psychiatric issues who have autism spectrum disorders, and those are clearly better served by DMH with assist from DDS. We have individuals for whom the primary issue is autism spectrum disorder, and those individuals will clearly be served by DDS. And then we have a large group of individuals in the middle who have recurring mental health issues that do not necessarily meet DMH's requirement or criteria for eligibility to have autism spectrum disorder. So it's that large group in the middle that we are currently working on with DMH to establish who's going to do what and what those services are likely to be. The statute requires that Mass Health provide coverage for ADA services. The standard is basically medical necessity. It is similar to some of what is currently being covered under ARECA. And although the state plan amendment has not been approved by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid yet, Health does have a process in place to provide the ADA services to individuals under EPSDT. And you go about, if you're an individual finding out to call the health employment centers, and for providers there is a different number so that you can become a qualified provider. We are thinking about what are the new community services that we need to develop. We expect this will take us some time, and in large measure we need to hear from individuals and families about what services we need to develop, what services we need to tweak, whether the services as they exist are appropriate, but what needs to change are the qualifications of the provider. So we really do need to hear from people, and that makes this a work in progress for us. So I think I will stop. I will take questions, and for those of you who don't want to use this chat function, you can clearly email me at the address you see below, and I will attempt to answer questions as they are posed to me.
Thank you, Janet. I'm looking for questions, and all I have to do is chat them in. Okay, hold on. We have something. If a denial of eligibility for adult services under the old rules in 2009 upon turning 18 was not appealed, does that have any impact on the application for eligibility made under the new rules?
In a situation that you're describing, the individual needs to apply as though they were seeking a new eligibility determination. So the answer is no. Because they are applying as a person with ASD, they simply need to apply now. Currently, the information for the criteria and the applications are on the DDS website. They are not intuitively obvious in terms of where to look for them. So if you are on the DDS homepage and you scroll down all the way on the right, at the bottom you will see information about eligibility, and that's what you click on to find the applications and the fact sheets.
Okay, that was answered. More about how the amount of medically necessary ABA is determined.
The question is about medical necessity for ABA. So the qualified practitioner who is suggesting that the person needs ABA provides the basis for Mass Health to make some determination about the medical necessity standards. So there are standards that Mass Health has. These are not DDS standards that Mass Health has. And they make those determinations through their own unit.
Should we get the ball rolling applying for benefits for children with an ASD approaching 18, now 17, who have ASD with no ID?
So for individuals who are approaching age 18, if are interested in applying for eligibility from DDS, you should go to the website, pull down the application, follow directions in the application, and then submit it to the department. So the directions on the applications are quite clear about the information that we'll be looking for, and then you simply send it to one of the department's 4 eligibility teams, and those addresses and phone numbers are located in the application package, which you can find on our website.
About rehab and autism, DD, dual eligibility?
The question about rehab and autism dual eligibility, and I'm not sure I understand the question. So if the question is, can you participate in a mass rehab service and also be a person eligible with autism under DDS, the answer is yes, if that's the question. You can participate in both programs, they just can't be for the same services.
Okay. An individual who was previously eligible for DDS as a child and then found eligible for DDS with adult autism, not ID, at age 18, should immediately be assigned to the new autism coordinator, or should they remain with the children's? coordinator that became involved? When does transition coordinator become involved?
So the question about when a case is transferred from the children's coordinator to a transition worker or to one of the new autism service coordinators is really based on the area director's management of his or her respective caseload. Since the individuals that are coming in are not evenly distributed, the children's caseloads are not equally distributed across the state, and nor is the number of individuals who are simply transitioning into the department. Each of the areas needs to make its best decision about how to best deploy the resources that it has.
Okay. If an individual who has previously eligible for DDS as a child, okay, that's that one already. Okay. Under the new proposed regulation, adult eligibility for DDS would be at age 18, but adult DDS services wouldn't start until age 22. What is the point of eligibility at age 18?
The point of eligibility at age 18 is that for some individuals, the desire to do earlier transition planning is important. It does mean that individuals who are less than 22 will be able to access those family support services that are available to children. So in essence, what's happening here is that children will be people between the ages of 5 and 22, and adult services will be accessible to people when they turn 22. The obvious caveat to that are for some individuals who are graduating from high school early or on time, what are the services the department will offer, and that's part of what we are currently working on.
Okay. Can you discuss the aspect of the learning portion of the 7 functional limitations? How will that be assessed?
The way the learning portion of the 7 domains is assessed is through the Major Life Activity Questionnaire, and they are really the ability to learn, to demonstrate that an individual can understand different dollar values, can do some problem solving. The LAC was designed was really to make it possible for individuals to meet one of those 7 domains. So it's not that rigorous a test at all.
It is understood that the regional teams are considering all 4 types of eligibility at once. However, what happens if denied for ID but wants to appeal? Do they lose ASD-only eligibility if appeal is denied? How does it work?
Okay, so this is a fairly complicated scenario. So if a person is denied ID eligibility, then they appeal, and that goes through the normal appeal process. If simultaneously are also a person who has been found eligible for ASD, they maintain their ASD eligibility affirmative status, and they appeal their ID status.
It is, okay, all right, that one is done. At the transition meeting, should you invite the DDS coordinator if you feel you'll be applying for the services for ASD?
You can invite the DDS coordinator. Whether or not the DDS coordinator is able to attend will really be a function of how many other people they are responsible for. It's also the reason not all of our SIS assessments are attended by our service coordinators either, because they need to be able to do other parts of their job.
Individual qualified for medically necessary BA through the age 21 up to the 22nd birthday, or does eligibility end on the 21st birthday? Eligibility
under EPSCT ends on the 21st birthday.
Young's eldest son had a neuropsych in 2009. He has an appointment in June for an updated one. Would it be helpful to you to have in determining him eligible? He has and anxiety depression, medical issues. When he graduated, we were told he would not qualify for DDS, so we just got referred to DMH, but never applied for DDS. Although if you're going to the State House, we'll meet you there next time to need to go to from cuts pending. Okay, so I have a question about is bringing both assessments.
I think that it would be helpful if you brought both assessments to the eligibility team process, and that your son was not eligible in 2009 is not surprising, since he does not apparently have an intellectual disability. So you should bring both your previous report and your new report to the eligibility team.
Okay. We can't hear questions. Okay. Does a formal diagnosis of PDNOS made in 1994, age 3, meet the manifested before age 22 criterion? The individual received SPED services from a school district on the basis of the diagnosis and reoccurring three evaluation from age 3 through high school at age 20.
This one is a little bit more complicated because it would really be a question about whether or not the individual has 3 substantial functional limitations. So there's more than just whether the person had a formal diagnosis. It's the quality of that diagnosis that was done in 1994, so it's hard for me to respond to this with actually seeing the records. But other issue will be whether or not the person has 3 functional limitations. So it may very well be that they have a formal diagnosis that we would verify that would meet that criteria of the eligibility requirements, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person has 3 functional limitations.
Okay. And providers become eligible to provide these services will be a new RFR contract or direct outreach to families and individuals that have received DDS funding through the ASD.
So for of the services that the department is currently going to offer to the expand population, the procurements are open. Many of them are called the supports qualifying. So you go to combis and you submit the paperwork. So these are open procurements. So you can qualify to provide individual supports or adult companion or respite. You can do this both as an individual or as an organization if you are not already qualified. For some of the employment services, some of those procurements are also remain open and some of them are closed. So it depends on what service you're interested in providing.
Okay. The emotional anxiety, depression, comorbidities of a person with ASD are often substantial. What happens if a person with ASD is not eligible for DDS under the MEAC because they can learn but cannot really apply their skills under realistic situations due to anxiety, etc.? I worry my kids will be caught in a gap between DDS and DMH.
The lesson really requires that the 2 departments figure out what that gap is and how best to address it. There are also a number of activities underway to increase the number of mental health providers and the skill they have to address the ASD population.
If I fluctuated between 70 and 75 and we didn't receive ID eligibility, is it worth appealing?
If a person's IQ fluctuates, you can apply as an intellectual disability, and if you believe that your family member has an autism spectrum disorder, you can apply as that as well. It's really the number of what that IQ presentation looks like. It's not just the single score, it's the distribution of scores as well, and that's frankly what our eligibility psychologists consider.
mobility criterion pertains specifically to bodily mobility, or does it include, for example, factors which impair ability, or does it impair mobility, the individual's ability to safely learn to drive?
The mobility criteria pertains more to bodily mobility. The issue about factors that impair safely learning to drive might be more reflected in either economic self-sufficiency or the capacity for self-direction, because those are more executive function kinds of issues.
Okay. How long will it take to hear back from the intake offices once the application has been sent?
The question is, when the department contacts individuals when the application is received. Now, it's important the application be complete, because the department begins running its clock for donation based on a completed application. So you may very well hear from the eligibility team that there are documents or pieces of information that are missing, and it will not proceed until it receives them. So you'll receive some notice or call from the eligibility team telling you what else it needs from you in order to move forward.
Okay, and then the slides will be available after the session, so that's several people have asked that question, if you wouldn't mind addressing that now.
I'd be more than happy to share them.
Okay, all right, any other questions, or? Okay, one more. Are DDS autism eligible individuals eligible for 688 funding?
DDS adults autism eligible individuals who only have ASD are not part of the 688 funding. If they have ID and ASD, so we're going to fund those individuals through our new appropriation.
Alrighty, I think I'll take it back. I think that's it.
Thanks for your attention and the very good questions that you asked. And again, if you have additional questions or topics that you wish to share with me, please feel free to email me at janet.george@state.ma.us. Thanks so much for your attention.
That's all the time we have for today. Again, we will be emailing you the PowerPoint, so not to worry. And I want to thank our presenter, Janet George, and Marissa Young, our tech advisor for today. Be sure to visit our website to view the next webinar on May 27th, 7 o'clock p.m. on the special health care needs of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.